Okay, so we're going to have a look at the falsification principle. The falsification principle, in my opinion, is quite difficult to get your head around, which is why you need a really good understanding of the verification principle, both strong and weak. So please make sure, particularly if you weren't in school the other day, please make sure that you have definitely understood the difference between the strong verification principle and the weak verification principle. But before we get started, we're going to do a quick little quiz. We do this most lessons anyway, so you should be familiar with this. Question number 1. The word bachelor is an example of what type of word? Now, the word that you're looking for here is a key word beginning with T, and it's really, really important to the strong verification principle. Question 2, who are the Vienna Circle and what was their main aim? So when were they formed? Why were they formed? Who are some key players within the Vienna Circle and what kind of time period were they formed in? What does the phrase eschatological verification mean? 4, what does verification in principle mean? And again, you're going to need to be able to understand the difference between strong verification and weak verification for that one. Who created the theory of verification in the first place? And then finally, what is the main question of the religious language scheme of work? So what is the point of it? Like, what are they actually trying to establish? So once you've answered all of those, and please look back through your book to help you if you want to, but once you've answered all of those, what I would like you to do now is to write down 3 things that are false and tell me how we know that they're false. So what evidence do we have to prove that they are not true? It's probably going to be a little bit more difficult than you think, but I need the evidence for why we know they're false in the first place. So a good example is something like... we know the world is not flat, and we know that because there's pictorial evidence of it. We can see the kind of trajectory of the Earth when we have a look at things like the horizon and out of a plane window and things like that. So we've got evidence to prove that the world is not false. See if you can come up with 3 other ideas or 3 other examples. Now, this is where I would usually ask for a bit of discussion and to try and figure out your own ideas about what you know to be false, but obviously we can't quite do that now we've moved to remote learning. But the ideas that you've got down are pinnacle to the ideas of the falsification principle, because it literally resides on proving things false to be able to assess whether or not they're meaningful, which is quite difficult to get your head around, but we're going to go through it together. Okay, so this guy here in the corner is a man called Karl Popper, and he is an Australian-British philosopher, and his main points is the idea that it's kind of founded in science. It's an empirical view to having a look at what is meaningful. And then Popper tries to apply this empirical view to the issues of religious language. So he basically says that any theory that is impossible to disprove is no valid theory at all. So he uses science and basically says that science comes up with hypotheses, and then looks for evidence to prove them wrong rather than proving them right. And so I'm going to explain a little bit more now. As I've said, he's really kind of founded in science. He is an atheist, so he didn't really look, well, he's more agnostic actually, but he didn't really look to provide evidence of God in the first place. So he uses scientific examples and suggests that something can only be accepted as meaningful and as true if science can show that it's false. Now, this is really confusing. So on the next slide, there's a short video clip, and on this video clip, just watch up until about 45 seconds in. It's the first link that you want. The second link that I've put on there is good to watch at the very, very end of this PowerPoint presentation. So I wouldn't worry about watching the second one in conjunction with the first one. Watch the second one at the very end of the PowerPoint. Okay, so this video is basically, the first video is basically saying that science comes up with a whole stream of hypotheses. So for example, swans are white, all swans are white. So rather than going out into the world and every single scientist looking for evidence, looking for evidence of more white swans, they would go out and have a look for evidence against that claim. So to try and falsify it. Now, if you've got evidence to falsify it, i.e. to say that actually not all swans are white, then that statement becomes meaningless because you've proved it false. Okay, but because we're going out and having a look at evidence against it, we have at least some idea what we need to do to prove the original statement true. So again, I hope you're getting this. I hope this isn't too confusing. But basically, what Popper is saying is that science, and we can see this, and it does happen, science looks for evidence against their hypothesis to try and prove it true in the first place, rather than trying to have a look at evidence to support it. So by falsifying something, by proving it false, we can then prove something meaningful. And again, we're going to go through this a bit more, so hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. Main points so far from Karl Popper is that he's founded all of his work in the ideas of science and empiricism. Okay, so he's got a real empirical approach to religious language, a real empirical approach to life, and to kind of looking at how we find truth. That's the whole point behind Karl Popper's philosophy, is how do we know what is actually true. So he says that scientists do not look for evidence to support their hypothesis, and instead they look for evidence against it, which the videos just showed you. So if no evidence can be found, then the hypothesis is true. Therefore, the hypothesis has been falsified and proven true. Okay, so you're using evidence against your hypothesis to be able to prove that your actual statement is true in the first place. So now he's had a look at this from a scientific point of view and actually been able to prove that science and scientists do look for evidence against their claims. He then has a look and turns this into religious language. So he says, if we want to make a statement meaningful, we need to be able to search for evidence against the statement. So an example of a statement could be something like, God is good. So under falsification principle, we would need to be able to have a look at evidence to falsify that claim. So there is evidence to falsify the ideas that God is good. So things like evil and suffering in the world. Okay, so because we're trying to find evidence against this initial hypothesis or this initial statement of God is good, then we are having a look at the evidence against that statement to verify whether or not that statement can be seen as meaningful. Now Popper adds to this a little bit more and basically says that we cannot and we will not at this moment in time, probably ever actually, be able to verify or falsify God, because we haven't got any evidence for him and we haven't got any evidence against him. Okay, so because we can't verify and because we can't falsify God, then any God claim, any statement about God himself or herself is completely meaningless. So Popper's ideas become really, really kind of forward thinking and really, really kind of inspirational to lots of people. Now the reason it became really inspirational is because it was founded in a scientific approach. And because it became really, really famous and really, really kind of convincing, a man called Anthony Flew, who was a British philosopher and also a negative atheist, so kind of like a militant atheist that we've kind of briefly had a look at in the ideas of secularization, he took on the ideas of Karl Popper and developed something called the parable of the gardener. So I'm going to read this little bit of the parable to you, and then I'm going to kind of unpick it so that it makes a bit more sense. It's a really, really famous parable, and it's been used quite a lot to be able to support the ideas of the falsification principle. It's really important to note though that although this parable of the gardener is how I've written it here, there are several different versions of it. They all basically mean the same thing, but some say it's a jungle that they stumble across, some say it's a garden. So you just need to be aware that there are slightly different versions. And Flew himself put forward slightly different versions, so there's no concrete one version of this. But it goes like this. Two explorers come across a clearing where there are weeds and flowers. The first explorer is convinced that there must be a gardener who comes to the clearing and looks after it. However, the second gardener disagrees. To settle the argument, both explorers decide to wait for a gardener, but he never appears. The first explorer suggests that the gardener may be invisible, so they both set up a trap, and yet still no gardener is found. The first explorer continues to argue his case about there being a gardener, and says that now the gardener is invisible, silent, intangible, and much more, leading to the second explorer to ask, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? So what I would like you to do, before moving on to the next slide, because the next slide gives you all the answers, so please try not to cheat. What does this parable actually mean? Try and put this parable into the ideas of God. Okay, try and think of that these two gardeners are arguing for the existence and arguing against the existence of God. How does it link to the ideas of the falsification principle? Might be a bit difficult, but have a go. Okay, so basically the parable of the gardener is, what do you call it? Metaphorical? Yeah, it's metaphorical. Okay, so it's a parable which is looking at an argument between an atheist or an agnostic and a theistic person, somebody who does believe in God versus somebody who doesn't believe in God. So the gardener is somebody who is meant to be God. Okay, he's elusive, he never comes, he's tending to the world. Okay, but it's meant to be God. The first explorer is a theist. Now we know that he's a theist because he keeps changing his assertion. Okay, so initially, it's just an invisible gardener. Oh, but when there's no evidence of that, it's now an invisible, intangible gardener. It's something that you can never see, touch, hear, smell, use your senses to understand. The second explorer is much more sceptical. Okay, so he is playing the idea of an atheist or an agnostic. He's basically saying, well, if there's no evidence for it, if we can't see him, we can't hear him, he's intangible, what remains of our original assertion that there is a gardener? Okay, because we've literally leaped from there is a gardener who comes into this garden and tends to it, to there's an intangible, invisible, you can't hear him, can't see him, can't touch him, gardener. Okay, so these two ideas are completely separate. And the traps that they lay out, i.e. to try and find out whether or not there is a gardener, is trying to prove something by sense. Okay, so basically the parable of the gardener is saying that we cannot see, hear, smell, touch, taste the ideas of God. So every time we try and put forward a hypothesis of God, we can't falsify it because there's no evidence behind it. We can't change that assertion in the first place. So then this kind of parable of the gardener moves on a little bit more and moves on to something called death of 1,000 qualifications, which we're going to have a look at on the next slide. So, death of 1,000 qualifications is the idea that Flew is putting forward to support Karl Popper's ideas of falsification. Okay, and he's moved away from the idea of the gardener and is now looking at whether or not the statements about God are meaningful. So he basically says that anybody who's a theist will always argue for evidence of God. So even when a person, an agnostic or an atheist, comes forward and says, oh, well, there's this evidence to suggest that God doesn't exist, a theist will always kind of move the goalposts. They're always going to change their original statement. So, for example, if a theist said, well, God is good, and an atheist then comes back and says, well, how can God be good if there's evil and suffering in the world? The theist would then say, well, it's humans' fault, the idea of free will and the original sin. Okay, and then the other person, the agnostic, might say, okay, well, that might explain moral evil, but what about ideas of natural evil? How can we explain that? I mean, natural evil has nothing to do with humanity, so how can God be good if there's natural evil and suffering? Then the theist might then come back and say, well, natural evil and suffering is a test from God. It's about making us develop as a human person. So basically, this theist, this person who believes in God, is always changing, is always trying to find some evidence to try and refute the agnostic or atheist's point of view. You're always trying to change the goalposts. Okay, so basically, you're dying a death of 1,000 qualifications. You can have this conversation 1,000 times, and 1,000 times a theist will always have an answer to prove that God exists. They can't understand, they cannot give you an answer which might falsify the idea of God. Because obviously a theist is not going to try and falsify God because they believe in them. So this then becomes a little bit of a problem, okay? Because the more that you battle for ideas to try and prove something, the more removed you are away from your original hypothesis. So basically, because we can't verify and because we can't falsify something, because particularly falsify, we can't falsify ideas of God because any theist always comes up with new evidences to try and support their statements, then the statements about God are empty. They're effectively meaningless because they've changed over and over and over and over again to try and fit their idea of what God might be. I'm finding this really awkward to film, so I'm hoping you're getting something out of it. Let me know. Okay, so main points of the power of the gardener is that how does the gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, i.e. how does the idea of a god differ from the idea of an imaginary, fake, false god? Well, there isn't any difference because we can always try and add something to the original claim to make it suit us, basically. So we're dying a death of 1,000 qualifications. We cannot prove or disprove the ideas of God. Now, that is basically the ideas of falsification in a nutshell. I'm just having a look at the AQA textbook now, and the definition for falsification is: a sentence is factually significant and meaningful if and only if there is some form of evidence which could falsify it. Okay, now because there is no evidence to falsify God, the statement is not meaningful. Now, falsification, like I said, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult ones to get your head around. I really struggle with falsification, and I don't know why. I've tried to teach it for 6 years, and I still can't quite fully get my head around it. So hopefully you are. But in a nutshell, the idea is that we can't falsify God, because every time we try to falsify God, there's a new assertion, there's a new piece of evidence to try and move the goalposts to make sure that God exists. So because there's no tangible evidence for or against God, any God talk is completely meaningless. Now, the ideas of falsification in the Vienna Circle and with the logical positivists became quite popular, but there were quite a few people who responded negatively towards ideas of falsification. Now, the first one is a man called Hare, and he's saying, Hare's basically saying that it's wrong of Flew and it's wrong of Popper to try and make religious beliefs, which is all about faith, scientific. Okay, Hare is basically saying that you can't make religious statements into scientific statements, so therefore you can't apply the same things together. So Hare then comes up with a word called a blick, And a blick is an unchanging belief. So anybody who believes in God for hair has a blick. Their blick, this unchanging belief, is that God is good or God is real, etc., etc. So, and religion is based on blicks. That's why it's a faith. That's why you can't prove it. You just have to kind of believe it. Okay, and Hare is actually saying that because religion is a blick and because religion has massive influences and massive impacts on people's lives, we can't dismiss them so easily as how we would dismiss a scientific statement. All of these responses, by the way, from Hare, Mitchell and Hick, we're all going to go and have a look through in subsequent lessons anyway. Basil Mitchell basically says that religious believers are not blind to the problems of faith and argues that religious belief does not have some grounding in reason. So he's basically saying that religious believers know that faith alone is quite difficult to explain and that you don't have to have evidence of faith. That's the whole idea of faith alone, isn't it? Because faith, by the very nature of it, is unprovable. And then Hick says that we can eschatologically verify God after death. Okay, so religious beliefs can be verified in principle because we can verify them when we reach those certain milestones. We can verify them. Oh, excuse me. We can verify them after death. So therefore, again, we can't link scientific ways of testing verifiability or falsifiability to issues of faith. Finally, this last slide is a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses. Now, although the falsification principle for the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists, and I just want to remind you that the logical positivists are looking for a logical answer to whether or not any God talk or religious language is meaningful. So obviously they're going to like ideas which are more scientific because science by its very nature is logical. So even though the falsification principle won quite a lot of favour within the Vienna Circle, there are quite a lot of weaknesses which come along with it. So we'll start with the weaknesses and then we'll move on to the strengths. Basically, one of the weaknesses is that we can say of the falsification principle is exactly the same thing that we said of the verification principle. Okay, it can't be tested. The entire principle can't be tested. So this links into circular logic. Now, if you were in the lessons last week, you'll know that circular logic is when you try to use the argument to make a weakness out of the argument, just like what Ganilo does in the ontological argument. He uses the ontological argument to prove that there is a weakness in it. So he uses the ontological argument to form the perfect island argument. By using the same logic, he's then flawed the argument entirely. So again, we can't verify and we can't falsify the falsification principle, which is an issue. Also, the falsification principle, just like the strong verification principle, is too rigid. Okay, it's too scientific. And just like people like Hare and Hick say, you can't link science and proving something true or false to faith and trying to prove faith true or false, because the very definition of faith is that we just have to believe it without evidence. Now, Flew and Popper come to understand that that the falsification principle is too rigid later on in their lives anyway. Like I've said again, statements about God are not scientific, they're metaphysical, so we can't apply the falsification principle to faith. And then finally, Flew's argument that the religious believers will not allow anything to falsify their claims is untrue. So we go back to the ideas of death of 1,000 qualifications. We've basically said that if we start with the original statement, God is good, and then the atheist or agnostic says, well, there's evil and suffering in the world. And then the theist says, well, that's because it's a test from God, blah, blah, blah. Okay, if we go back to that idea and the dying of a death of 1,000 qualifications, that actually in some cases has worked, because there are some people who were religious to begin with and then saw the amount of evil and suffering in the world and then have rejected faith. So actually, again, the death of 1,000 qualifications does not fit for all religious people. Having said that, the main strength is that religion makes an important factual claim. Okay, so the religion categorically says God made the earth, or I don't know, well, let's just go with that. God made the earth. Okay, so because if they're making those types of factual claims, factual statements, then we should be able to apply a factual way of looking at things, i.e. a scientific way, to those statements. And because we can't, the falsification principle succeeds in proving that religious language is meaningless. And then also, finally, the main criteria for the falsification principle and to know what makes something meaningful is to know what might falsify the assertion. Religious believers do not know what will falsify their claims. So again, religious believers don't have any evidence to prove or disprove God. They don't have any concrete evidence, and therefore, again, the falsification principle succeeds in the idea is that any God talk is meaningless because we've got nothing either to verify or falsify our claims. So that is the